At 9:20 on the morning of 1st January, 1945, leading aircraftsman Desmond Shepard of No. 137 Squadron was crossing the runway at Eindhoven in the Netherlands when he heard gunfire and looked up. What he saw was not a British Typhoon or a returning Spitfire. It was a low-flying German fighter, followed by more Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s, coming in so fast that there was barely time to hit the grass. At Ursel in Belgium, Sergeant Peter Kroost had just reported for duty when he saw another formation racing in at mast height. At Brussels Evier, a Royal Air Force officer phoned headquarters to report enemy aircraft over the field, and was told, with New Year disbelief still in the voice on the line, that it was 1st January, not 1st April. This was not a prank. It was Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last large-scale offensive in the West. The tactical reality behind that attack was brutal. Since the Normandy landings, the Allied 2nd Tactical Air Force, the United States 9th Air Force, and the 8th Air Force's long-range escorts had pushed the Luftwaffe out of daylight control over northwest Europe. German armored columns in the Ardennes had gained their first success in December 1944 under cloud cover. But once the skies opened, Allied fighter bombers came back in force. Luftwaffe's own situation was worse than the aircraft totals on paper suggested. From 17th to 27th December alone, it lost 644 fighters destroyed and another 227 damaged in operations over the Western Front. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the last senior fighter leaders still standing, was candid about the condition of the force. The young pilots being fed into combat were timid, inexperienced, and not ready for battle. In plain terms, Germany still had machines. It no longer had time. The answer from Hitler's headquarters was not subtle. On 16 September 1944, Hitler had already ordered General-Lieutenant Werner Kreipe to prepare the air arm for a Western offensive. On 14 November, Hermann Göring directed the 2nd Jagd Division and 3rd Jagd Division to make ready for a major ground attack operation, with preparations to be complete by 27 November. The requirements were exact: a low-level strike, complete radio silence, simultaneous crossings of the front, and surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France. Pilots were to be briefed as late as possible. Maps were deliberately incomplete in case aircraft fell into Allied hands. The timing was fixed for a dawn arrival, when Allied aircraft were expected to be parked, refueling, or just beginning their first sorties of the new year. That was the problem Germany thought it could solve in one morning. It would not fight for air superiority over the Reich by outflying the Americans and British in open sky. It would try to smash their air power on the ground instead. A desperate idea, a very German one, by 1945. Carefully ordered on paper, dangerously brittle in practice. The planning of Bodenplatte tells you almost as much as the battle itself. Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, had long argued for a concentrated blow against the bomber stream in the air, a grosser Schlag, using what was left of Germany's fighter arm in one-mast interception. But Galland was increasingly on the wrong side of Göring, and by late 1944 his influence had been cut back. The job of shaping the new offensive went instead to General Major Dietrich Peltz, a bomber specialist appointed to command 2nd Fliegerkorps on 8 December. He was energetic, loyal, and willing to promise what the system above him wanted to hear. That mattered. By then, the deadlines were already crushing. Final planning conferences ran through early and mid-December. The operation was originally intended to support the Ardennes offensive from 16th December, but bad weather delayed it again and again. Every postponement made secrecy harder and navigation more complicated. Yet the order remained. No broad briefing, no radios, no loose talk. Even many German flak units were not fully informed, because surprise was considered more important than coordination. That was the bureaucratic logic of the late war Luftwaffe. Keep information tight, hope the missing pieces solve themselves. The men assembling the strike force saw the reality at ground level. Ground crews worked through the night on scattered bases across northwestern Germany. Fuel bowsers, ammunition belts, flare pistols, smoke markers, All of it had to be pushed out in darkness. Sergeant Werner Mulga later remembered turning into a field and seeing 50 FW-190D9 lined up as if for parade inspection. There was nothing elegant about it. Oil on gloves, frost on cowling panels, mechanics fitting belts into MG-151/20 cannon, and checking the twin MG-131 over the engine. Others prepared BF-109 G-14 and K-4, or the long-range FW-190 G-1 fighter bombers assigned to units like JG-6. Pathfinding Ju-88 were loaded with flares and smoke. Some Me-262 of KG-51 were assigned to the operation as well. Though jets would never be the center of the strike, the force eventually assembled under Peltz included JG-1, JG-2, JG-3, JG-4, JG-6, JG-11, JG-26, JG-27, JG-53, JG-54, JG-77, and elements of SG-4. Their targets formed a belt of Allied air power. Eindhoven, Volkel, Heesch, Asch, Sint-Truiden, Leculo, Melsbroek, Brussels-Aver, Grimbergen, Ursel, Maldegem, Sint-Danis-Westrum, Gilserigen, Woensdrecht, and Metz-Frascati among them. Some wings were split between two airfields. Some crews were given routes that crossed dense German flak zones near V2 launch areas around The Hague. The official demand was for all formations to hit at once, just after dawn, and this is where the unfairness inside the system shows itself. The men taking off were told they were executing a precise, coordinated operation. In truth, the planning staff had handed them an impossible compromise. Incomplete maps, green pilots, rigid radio silence, and routes that depended on every clock being right, and every gunner already warned. Galland had wanted a fighter battle. Peltz had built a surprise raid. But the pilots and ground crews would be the ones paying for the gamble. Before sunrise on New Year's Day, the Luftwaffe put just under 1,000 aircraft into motion. It was one of the largest single efforts the German fighter arm had mounted in the final stage of the war. By then, the machines were airborne. The bureaucracy was finished. Now came the part that could not be corrected on paper. The first minutes proved that surprise had been real, but also that surprise was not enough. JG-3, led by Oberstleutnant Heinrich Baer, hit Eindhoven hard. Hawker Typhoons of 438 and 440 squadrons were caught taxiing or lifting off. Flight Lieutenant Peter Wilson was shot down. Flying Officer Ross Keller was killed trying to get airborne. For a brief stretch, the attack looked exactly like what Peltz had promised. A fast, low-level smash, cannon fire walking through parked aircraft, fuel and ammunition going up on the ground. At Asch, designated Y-29, the story turned sharply. This field held P-47D Thunderbolts of the 366th Fighter Group and P-51 of the 352nd Fighter Group. JG-11 came in expecting another easy pass over parked Allied aircraft. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer was already rolling. Wheels barely up, he spotted FW-190 crossing the field and shot one down almost at once. Captain William T. Wisner joined fight and claimed 4 victories in the swirling melee. On the ground, American crewmen watched from the edge of the strip and fired pistols at aircraft passing overhead. It sounds absurd. It happened. The air battle over Y-29 became one of the clearest signs that Bodenplatte had attacked an enemy far more flexible than the planners understood. The technical contrast mattered. German units were arriving in BF-109 and FW-190, optimized for speed, climb, and concentrated cannon fire. The FW-190D9 carried 2 MG-151/20 cannon and 2 MG-131 machine guns. Late BF-109 variants packed heavy nose armament into a narrow, high-performance airframe. They were dangerous fighters, but at low level on unfamiliar routes, flown by unevenly trained men, they became unforgiving machines. The Allied aircraft waiting below were built into a deeper system. The P-47D, with its radial engine and 8.50 caliber Brownings, could absorb punishment and still claw into a fight. The P-51 had range, visibility, and disciplined radio control. The Typhoon was a rugged low-level strike aircraft with 4 20mm Hispano cannon and ground crews used to turning it around quickly on advanced landing grounds. Germany was still fielding sharp weapons. The Allies were fielding a whole maintenance civilization, and there was improvisation everywhere. German crews had adapted interceptor and fighter-bomber variants to a mission many had never rehearsed at full scale. Pilots flew with maps that marked targets, but often omitted full approach routes. Some formations followed Ju-88 Pathfinders dropping flares. Others lost them and drifted. Friendly flak took aircraft on the way in. Theo Nebel of 10/JG-54 even came down after a bird smashed into the radiator of his FW-190D9 at low altitude. At Metz Frascati, JG-53 hit parked American aircraft, but paid dearly, with a loss rate around 48%. At Brussels Ever and Melsbrook, German cannon fire wrecked transports, fighters, and support aircraft, including Air Marshal Arthur Conningham's personal Dakota. Yet again and again, successful first passes were thrown away because inexperienced pilots climbed, circled back, or flew straight through defensive fire instead of exiting low and fast. By noon, the last formations were straggling home. Some had hit exactly the right target. Some had attacked empty or lightly occupied airfields. Some had been cut up before reaching the objective. Only a minority of the Luftwaffe's Gruppen achieved the kind of timing and surprise the plan demanded. The operation worked in fragments. That was the fatal flaw. What happened next is why Bodenplatte is remembered less as a blow against the Allies than as a self-inflicted wound by the Reich. The Luftwaffe had borrowed, in effect, the Allied method of low-level armed sweeps against exposed aircraft on the ground. That alone tells you how far the German fighter arm had fallen. It could no longer defend the Reich by contesting the bomber stream at altitude, so it turned to the kind of forward airfield strike the Allies could absorb, and Germany could not. The scale of that difference showed up almost immediately. On the Allied side, the damage was serious. Roughly 300 aircraft were destroyed, with many more damaged, across the attacked airfields, but most were caught parked. Pilots were not lost in equivalent numbers. Maintenance units, transport columns, and replacement pools were already built into the Allied system. At Metz Frascati, Major George Brooking later showed captured JG-53 pilot Stefan Kohl a line of fresh replacement P-47 that had already arrived from Paris. Kohl looked at them and understood the point at once. That, he said, was what was beating Germany. On the German side, the price was different in kind. Aircraft losses ran to roughly the same order of magnitude as the title of this story suggests, depending on whether damaged write-offs are counted with those destroyed outright. More important, the Luftwaffe lost 143 pilots killed or missing, 70 captured, and 21 wounded in a single morning. Among them were 3 Geschwader Commodore, 5 Gruppenkommandure, and 14 Staffel leaders. That was leadership capital, not metal. You could not truck it in from a depot, and all of it had been done in support of a Western offensive that itself depended on a logistics structure already failing. The German army in the West still leaned heavily on rail movement, horse-drawn transport, and fuel allocations that never matched paper plans. The fighter force suffered the same shortages in a different form. Airframes existed. Aviation gasoline did not. Training hours shrank. Navigation discipline slipped. Coordination between air and flak units frayed. By January 1945, the Reich could still mount a dramatic effort. It could no longer sustain one. Post-war analysis was cold on the matter. Studies based on German records concluded that only a small portion of the attacking Gruppen reached target on time and in proper order. Allied reports were equally blunt. The damage on the ground was measurable, but the effect on Allied air operations was fleeting. Within days, aircraft replacements and repairs had erased much of the tactical gain. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had spent veteran leaders and trained pilots it could not replace before the war ended. So when people ask what day Germany lost 300 fighters over the Reich, the answer is not just a date, it is a diagnosis. On 1st January 1945, over Eindhoven, Asch, Brussels, Metz, and the other forward airfields of the Western Front, the Jagdwaffe exposed the truth about its condition. It did not fail because the Bf-109 or the FW-190 had suddenly become poor aircraft. They had not. It failed because an air force is more than the machines at dispersal. It is fuel, maps, radios, gunnery coordination, trained section leaders, replacement pipelines, and mechanics who can keep squadrons alive for months, not just launch them once. That is why the morning comes full circle back to Desmond Shepard on the runway at Eindhoven. From the ground, what he saw looked terrifying. German fighters at treetop height, cannon flashes, aircraft burning where they stood. For a few minutes, the Luftwaffe had managed to make 1940 seem possible again, but only for a few minutes. By the time the surviving raiders turned east, the attack had already become something else. The Reich's fighter arm spending its last reserve in one throw, damaging airplanes that could be replaced, and losing pilots who could not. It was not a glamorous end. It was an administrative, mechanical, and human collapse made visible in daylight. Germany did not lose that day because the attack lacked courage. Many of the men flying it had plenty of that. Germany lost because courage was all that was left at the sharp end, while the Allied side had the deeper thing behind it. Utility, reliability, repair capacity, fuel, and numbers. In war, that usually wins. On New Year's morning in 1945, it did. If you have a relative who served during this era, who operated, built, or fought alongside one of these machines, I would be honored to read their name, their unit, and their year in the comments below. Their stories are worth keeping alive. If this story gave you something you hadn't heard before, hit the like button. It tells the platform to put careful, sourced history in front of more people who actually want it. Subscribe if you want the next one.